Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Anderson House in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Andy Morrison. I'm the Interim Executive Director and Director of Development for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of Cincinnati. I'm pleased to tell you that this program is made possible tonight in part by generous support from the Massachusetts Society of Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes the knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence, and we do that through an array of donor-funded educational programs. The Institute's main objective is to preserve the timeless ideals upon which this nation was established. Those ideals, such as liberty, equality, freedom, civic responsibility, natural and civil rights, and the rule of law, have shaped our nation's history as well as scores of other countries worldwide. Those nonpartisan ideals are as important and as relevant today as they were in 1775. Along with this lecture tonight, the Institute's work includes supporting advanced study, developing changing museum exhibitions and other historic programs and tours, advocating for historic preservation and for teaching of the principles behind the founding of our nation, and also providing resources to classrooms nationwide that assist teachers, students, and scholars alike. Tonight's topic is the Gaspee affair, which is a fascinating story and yet one not well known. But it's fascinating because it was a significant incident leading up to the American Revolution. Now, while not enough Americans are familiar with this story, I can guarantee you that the Rhode Islanders are. They know it well. And there are few citizens of the Ocean State who enjoy telling this yarn more than one of our guests tonight. We're especially pleased to have with us the Honorable Sheldon Whitehouse, and he's going to provide some brief context in advance of the lecture. Since 2007, Mr. Whitehouse has served as one of Rhode Island's United States Senators. He is passionate about this story, so much so that his annual anniversary tributes about this incident from the floor of the United States Senate are most worthy of their YouTube popularity. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Senator Sheldon Whitehouse.
Thank you. Well, it is a great honor and joy to be here at the August Society of the Cincinnati to expand the fame of the wonderful Gaspee incident. I will make 2 points. The first is that the context for this is revenue collection efforts up and down the Northeast coast. And there's probably more work to be done on that generally, but the ship, the Liberty, was seized to the great irritation of its owner, John Hancock. And the ship, the Fortune, was seized to the great irritation of its owner, Nathaniel Greene. And as you know, John Hancock went on to be the famous signatory of the Declaration. And Nathaniel Greene was Washington's aide-de-camp and ran the Southern campaign, and was so effective at that General Cornwallis wrote to his wife, "That damned Greene is more dangerous than Washington." So scroll back to those 2 seizures, and who knows what might have happened had those 2 gentlemen not been as irritated by the revenue collection efforts of the British Crown. But the Gaspee incident was of particular significance. First, it was extremely clever. The ship, the Hannah, that was being pursued by the Gaspee, led the Gaspee over shallows off of Namquid Point, off Patuxet, Rhode Island. And the Hannah, being shallower, was able to scoot over the shallows. Lieutenant Duddingston, the captain of the Hannah, not aware of the waters as well as Captain Benjamin Lindsay of the Hannah, steered in pursuit and jammed on a sandbar in a falling tide. So cleverness created a ripe target. Boldness took advantage of the opportunity. That night, the Hannah's crew and others rowed down all the way from Providence with muffled oars in the night and attacked the Gaspee. And the first blood of what became the revolutionary conflict was drawn that night when a musket ball hit Lieutenant Duddingston of the Gaspee. The Rhode Islanders succeeded. They took over the boat. They took the crew ashore. Lieutenant Duddingston survived with the care of a doctor, and they lit the boat on fire, hence the image in Stephen Park's wonderful book of the Gaspee burning. It did, in fact, get to the powder magazine and blow to smithereens, and we are now looking in Rhode Island for the pieces. And the last part of the story is that this was early, not just clever, not just bold, but early. It happened in June of 1772, which is more than a year and a half before the worthies of Boston, Massachusetts screwed up their independent energies enough to go to a British ship and push tea bales off of it into Boston Harbor, which is all well and fine for Massachusetts, but let's not forget that more than a year earlier in Rhode Island, we blew the damn boat up. Thank you all for giving it the attention it deserves, and I will hand you back to the program and you will enjoy hearing from Stephen Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, for being here this evening with us. And it's going to be a very interesting topic, 250th anniversary of the Gaspee, one of the first acts of rebellion unheard of. Not many people think of 1772 as part of the American Revolution, but we sure do here. So my name is Andrew Allen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. And as the two speakers before me alluded, tonight's lecture features Dr. Stephen Park of Wheaton College discussing the burning of His Majesty's schooner Gaspee. On June 9, 1772, a group of prominent Rhode Islanders rowed out to the British schooner Gaspee, which had run aground 6 miles south of Providence while on an anti-smuggling patrol. After threatening and shooting its commanding officer, the raiders looted the vessel and burned it to the waterline. Despite colony-wide sympathy for the raid, neither the government in Providence nor authorities in London could let this pass without a response. As a result, a royal commission of inquiry headed by Rhode Island Governor Joseph Wanton zealously investigated the incident. Dr. Stephen Park reveals that what started out as a customs battle over the seizure of a prominent citizen's rum was soon transformed into one of the sparks that ignited patriot fervor in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War. This lecture commemorates the 250th anniversary of the Gaspee affair and is part of our ongoing initiative to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Stephen Park, our speaker this evening, received his PhD in history from the University of Connecticut, where he taught United States and maritime history for 17 years before joining the Institute for Teaching and Learning as an education technologist. He currently serves as the Director of Academic and Scholarly Technology at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and has written several articles that have appeared in numerous publications, including International Maritime History, American Neptune, Journal of the American Revolution, Connecticut History Review, and Dr. Park is also the author of The Burning of His Majesty's Schooner Gaspee, an attack on Crown rule before the American Revolution, published by Westholme Publishing in 2016. Now, before I turn things over to Dr. Park, there are a few housekeeping items that are in order for those of you tuning in with us at home or wherever you are via Zoom. Following this evening's lecture, there will be a question and answer session. Please feel free to submit your questions for Dr. Park using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate that with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, without further delay, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Stephen Park.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening on the actual anniversary of the 250th anniversary of the Gaspee affair. And it's also, I did not expect this to not be in Rhode Island this evening. I spoke last month on Rhode Island's Independence Day. I spoke to a large gathering in Providence about the 250th anniversary. And when you're in Rhode Island and you talk to folks, their kids have marched in the parade, their neighbor runs in the fun run. They go down to the river to see the burning of a Gaspee. That there's a model that's made out of sheet metal, so they can reuse it year after year. And we've been doing this since 1966. So people in Rhode Island know the Gaspee affair. As soon as you cross the border into Connecticut or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Nothing. You know, so teachers assign it in school, the kids write reports in school, and then as soon as you leave Rhode Island, people really don't know much about it. But I'll just let you know, because we're talking about the Society of Cincinnati, in 1774, on the second anniversary of the raid, George Washington was already setting off fireworks. So before other things happened in the cause, excuse me, not yet General Washington was already recognizing the Gaspee affair. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the Gaspee. The first thing I want to talk about is some of my colleagues in history have become very activist in their understanding of the past. And they use the understanding of history to just say, you know what, just burn the whole thing down. Let's just start over. And they only see horrible, awful things in America's past. While some of my colleagues are somewhat apathetic or even defensive about America's past. They might have a very nostalgic view of the past, and they get very defensive when we take a deep dive into the past. Let's try to end somewhere in the middle here. Let's try to engage our past with humility, look at and find the truth of what happened, and then from that truth, talk about it with humility. So I'm trying to avoid these two extremes, and I hope you'll join me tonight. My talk does take a little bit of an arc, and so you'll see where it gets bad before it gets better. But I think I can leave you on a very positive note, and I hope I do that tonight. So let's get into it. So how did this get started? So in 1763, at the end of what we call the French and Indian War, or what Europeans call the 7-Year War, Britain had been spectacularly successful in their victory over France. So there had been almost 100 years of wars between France and England. They were at war more than they were not at war. And but ultimately, this is how the map looked to the government in London. They said, what we need to do is put 10,000 soldiers along the Appalachian Mountain Range right here. So right on this range here, maybe 14 battalions of soldiers. Let's put 20 vessels out at sea of this North American squadron, and we'll kind of seal off these Anglo colonies from their opponents, from their enemies. But we'll also create a reserve for American in Indian country, they called it, and that'll help maintain the peace. So the land west of that, of the Appalachians, this would be a natural dividing line for the London government. But this is a time where the London government paid £5 million a year of interest on debt when they were only bringing in £8 million a year. So they were horribly in debt. And so they had to raise taxes to try to keep up with this expanding empire. And so you could move north and south, you could move to Canada, you could move to Florida. They just didn't want you to move west. Some Anglo settlers were actually required to come back east of the Appalachians so they could be within the protection of His Majesty's government. So that's where we were in 1763. But the colonists didn't see it that way. They saw a nefarious pattern here. So the taxes would go up in the Stamp Act, and then there would be protests, and then they would repeal it, and then a new ministry would come along. So then the Rockingham ministry would come along, and there'd be new taxes, and there would be protests, and then there would be repeal. And they see this pattern of rinse and repeat through the 1760s. So by the end of the decade, all the taxes, well, except for tea and the importation of enslaved people, all other taxes had been repealed. So it's funny, when I've gone to the Gaspee Day Parade, I heard somebody say through the loudspeaker one time that Rhode Island was pushing back against the hated Stamp Act. And I'm like, that's not exactly true. The Stamp Act had long been repealed. That's not what the Gaspee affair was about. So my book has over 600 footnotes in it, so you can tell exactly where I got my information from. What we'd really like to do, what our end game is we'd like to make a movie about the Gaspee affair, but we can't have a movie till we have a book. So I give you a book. So here's what Rhode Island looked like to the folks in Whitehall and the folks in London. There's a mutual distrust between these two parties. There is a reputation that Rhode Island had as a land of mobs, pirates, smugglers, and other undesirables. And when I say that in Rhode Island, of course, everybody laughs. You guys didn't laugh, that's okay. But that's certainly the reputation they had in the 18th century. And it was especially bad in Newport. They assumed that the folks in Newport were just a bunch of pirates. Rhode Islanders believed the Crown still owed them quite a bit of money for their faithful service in the French and Indian War. And so each party thought poorly of the other. So that's just sort of the context going into this. Okay, let's put the Gaspee affair in the right spot. Both the senator and Andrew helped you with that already. But just so you know where we are, 1770 was the King Street riot, or you and I know it as the Boston Massacre. So some of you saw the John Adams special that was on HBO a few years ago. It portrayed very well, I thought, of John Adams defending the Crown soldiers in the Boston Massacre. And then 1773, what the senator just referred to as well, the Boston Tea Party. We're right in that little, what used to be called the lull. So historians have portrayed this as a time where nothing happened. It was a lull. And actually, it was the Gaspee affair that awakened patriots during the lull. And I'll show you that here in just a minute. So let's go back and talk about what happened. You got a quick summary in my introduction, but let me take you through month by month. So in January 1772, Admiral Montague ordered the Gaspee into Narragansett Bay. And so what had happened was at the end of the French and Indian War, remember I mentioned that they needed a fleet, a North American fleet of about 20 to 25 vessels. They got 6 small schooners and sloops that could go deep into the, I shouldn't say deep, they can go shallow and going close to land, and they can interdict smugglers. What smugglers do is they keep moving goods to smaller and smaller vessels so they can go into shallower and shallower waters, so they can avoid the big piers, they can avoid the big cities, they can avoid the large wharfs, so they can do things in a more clandestine way. So in order to interdict smugglers, you need shallow draft vessels that can go into shallow water. So the Gaspee was one of 6 vessels that was purchased in 1765, and they were given French place names because of the British victory over France, the St. Lawrence, the Magdalene, the Gaspee, the place names from French Canada. So in any case, in 1772, Admiral Montague up in Boston ordered the Gaspee into Narragansett Bay. By February, Lieutenant Dunningston had seized sugar, rum, and spirits from one Jacob Green, and you recognize the name Green from the prominent Rhode Island family that we later know from Nathaniel Green, same family, and stops the fortune. He goes to get this rum condemned, and he takes it to the Vice Admiralty Justice up in Boston and sets a court date for condemning the cargo in March. By April, in March and April, a heated exchange of letters takes place where the Admiral up in Boston, Lieutenant Dunningston on the deck of the Gaspee, and Governor Wanton in the governor's mansion in Providence are having a heated exchange of letters. And now you can read these online. During COVID, the Secretary of State in Providence used her archivists and some of the time that they had when they weren't able to do the public service they normally do, and she had them digitize all the documents around the Gaspee affair for this anniversary. And now they're all available on the Providence Secretary of State's website, which is amazing. But in any case, you can see the letters there about the legitimacy of the Gaspee's mission. They want to know what are Dunningston's orders? What is he doing in Narragansett Bay? We want to specifically know what his orders are. In April, Admiral Montague sends the Beaver to help protect the Gaspee. So that tells you that he already thinks there's some danger brewing that this early on. By May, Admiral Montague warns Captain Lindsay of the Beaver to have as little contact with locals as possible and don't go ashore. Now, I don't have a letter from Montague to Dunningston telling him not to go ashore because his letters were destroyed and burned or thrown overboard. But I'm assuming he told Dunningston the same, right? But we just don't have it. So wait, what happened? So on June 9th, 1772, both sides agree to this. Some raiders gathered, they rowed out and boarded the Gaspee that had run hard aground off of Namquid Point, now renamed Gaspee Point. And they were looking for Dunningston's orders. Everybody agrees on that. Either these orders went over the side into a boat or over the side into the water and are lost to history. It's unclear which. They were looking for Jacob Green's rum, and that either went over the side into a boat or into the water and is lost to history. We're not sure. Both sides agree that the men were put ashore unharmed. Both sides agree that someone claimed to be a sheriff and a sheriff of Kent County, and Lieutenant Dunningston was shot. He didn't think he was going to survive the night. They thought he might have been murdered. And then a fire appears to be set, and that it wasn't an accident. And the reason I say the fire was set is all the men were safely put ashore unharmed. If it had been an accident, well, it seems like it was intentional, right? where they carefully put the men ashore. So that's what happened. There's no mention of Liberty or King George III. At this point, it's a dispute between Providence merchants, maybe Bristol as well, and customs collection, right? They don't know that the War of Independence is coming. They don't know the revolution is coming. They don't have none of this knowledge yet. They don't know that it's in the near future. So this is just a raid. It's not yet an affair. Let's talk about what makes this an affair. And that's really what this presentation is about tonight. So when we study the past and we study versus the study of history, what do we do when we talk to undergraduate students or when we talk to high school students about studying history? Here's what we talk about. We talk about the 5 C's. First of all, you need context. You need to know what's the context in which this is happening. The past is really a foreign country. It's not a foreign planet. It's not so alien to us that we can't understand it, but it's certainly a foreign country. They speak a little bit different language. They think differently about things. They treat other people differently from how we do now. And so it is a foreign country. You need some context. It's complex. It's never just a simple binary. There's always multiple actors with multiple motives. It's never as simple as we make it out to be. We're always very reductionist when we look at the past. We want to reduce it to a few bullet points we can remember, but that doesn't always do justice to the past. Things change over time. How we look at events change. It's funny, I saw somebody write on Facebook the other day, oh, this is just domestic terrorism. I'm like, read my book. Okay, so people, how we view things change over time. Causality, historians like to look at this happened first, then this happened next, then this happened next. We like cause and effect. The last thing we talk about when we work with students is contingency. Historical actors had choices in front of them, and they could have made several choices, and they made this one. Now, it's counterfactual to say, oh, well, what if they had done this? Or what if they had had that? Who knows? It would have been different, but we can't know that. But we do know that they have a series of choices in front of them. They chose to take a certain path, and that has consequences. So these are the things we talk about. Every generation gets to write its own history. We don't stay locked in a particular view of history or a particular view of the past. It's always changing, and every generation gets to write his or her own history. And we'll talk about what young scholars might do with this going forward here in a minute. So what do we have? We have the silence of the local population. We have very passive resistance. So we already have competing narratives. What Lieutenant Dunningston is telling his admiral and what we later learn from local patriots are 2 different stories. Dunningston is badly injured. He refuses to speak to the deputy governor of Rhode Island, Deputy Governor Sessions, but the governor of the colony, Governor Wanton, he's democratically elected. Connecticut and Rhode Island both had democratically elected governors. Everybody else had a royal governor who was appointed. They offered a reward right away for information, 100 pounds, a lot of money. They needed to seem like they were zealous in finding the perpetrators. A royal commission of inquiry was called by the crown in August. They investigated, they got together some prominent citizens, they conducted an investigation, and they found nothing. So their conclusion in 1773, the Royal Commission of Inquiry is unable to prosecute anyone. Most of their report, about a fifth of their report, is them bragging about their own zeal. They're like, we were really diligent in our duties. We worked really hard. We were very conscientious. Nobody can find any fault in us. And then another fifth of the report is just them vilifying Lieutenant Dunningston. He was overzealous in carrying out his duties. He was harassing the honest merchants of this colony, and they sort of make him out to be like a bad cop. So Dunningston's just a bad cop. And that is one of the roles of a Royal Commission of Inquiry, is to look at both sides of the story. It's an investigative committee. It has no jurisprudence. It has no judicial authority. It's just a research committee. And so that's what they did. So an enslaved, a man named Aaron Biggs, comes forward and gives an account that was quickly discredited by Rhode Island elites. So he claims he was there that night. He's able to name names. He does name names. He's in so much danger that Admiral Montague has to put him on board the Beaver and then personally come down from Boston and escort him to Colony House with under guard so that the man is not lynched. And so Aaron Biggs is the only colonial at the time who gave testimony and named names. We'll talk about Mr. Biggs again, of what he was really up to and what he was really doing. There's some interesting research coming out on him now. Governor Wanton cleverly kept the Gaspee Mariners, the people who had seen the raiders that night, and the raiders from meeting. So there's a chart in my book, and I show you that the men who could actually identify the raiders would be called to Colony House one day, and they would take their testimony and they'd take their statement, and then they'd send them home. Then the next day, they would bring the raiders in, and they would give testimony, and they would speak, and they would give sworn testimony. But this way, they wouldn't pass in the hallway, they wouldn't see each other, they couldn't identify each other. So it's pretty clear that Governor Wanton is obstructing justice. He wants to make sure that no Rhode Island person is prosecuted for anything. He's protecting his friends and protecting his colony. Other colonial accounts come decades later. The doctor who treated Dunningston's wounds, Dr. Monty and Ephraim Bowen, both give testimony decades later, looking back on that night, and they offer some more details that we didn't know. So at Dunningston's court-martial, he sails back to London. He goes to Portsmouth in October of 1772 in the UK, and there's no mention of the Hannah in his story. He doesn't talk about pursuing anybody. He says, oh yeah, I was headed up to Providence to pick up some sailors who came down from Boston. No mention of the Hannah. He reported that there might have been as many as 250 raiders that overwhelmed the 19 men on his small schooner. He had to make it look like, here he is, a commissioned naval vessel on station that was overwhelmed by civilians. So he's got to make it look like he was vastly outnumbered. But he talks about mob activity. Of course, you guys know Rhode Island. It's just a colony of smugglers and pirates. And so he gets off with a slap on the wrist. It didn't really even hurt his career. So he went back to his career and remained in the Navy for many more decades, continued to advance in rank. I believe he got up to Rear Admiral by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So it didn't hurt his career at all. So like I said, there are a couple of colonial eyewitnesses that come up decades later. They appear in the Bristol Day Parade, on the 4th of July parade, these men do. People started to admit in their obituary that they had been there that night, raiding the Gaspee. So as they would pass away, they would have it included in their obituary or on their gravestone that they were among the raiders. So now we know the names of dozens of these men. They said the Gaspee was pursuing the Hannah. They were lured by Captain Lindsay to get the Gaspee alone, to get it apart from the Beaver. They claimed that a man named Buckland shot Lieutenant Dunningston on impulse. He saw Dunningston, asked for a gun, and shot him. And that now they have the 2020 hindsight of a long and bloody war, and of what some people call a civil war fought within the British Empire. So the conclusion is that Jacob Green's rum here seems to have been forgotten already. So already by the early 19th century, the way people are telling the story, there's little mention of Green's rum, and there's much more talk about it being the first shot of the American Revolution. So this is the Whig version of the story, or the radical Whig version of the story. It stood for more than a century. It was told by living eyewitnesses in the 1820s. Documentary history was made by the 1840s, and official history was made by the 1860s. And then in the Gilded Age, we got some juvenile fiction, and I'll just go through these quickly. Here's a beautiful teacup set that came out at the Centennial in 1872, and it says, First National Centennial Anniversary, 1872, First Blow for Freedom, Gaspee. And that's a beautiful teacup set. So this is a copy of a book that I have in my office by Judge William Staples. He was one of the founders of the Rhode Island Historical Society. He printed 125 copies of this book for some of his close personal friends. I got a copy a few years ago. The originals were all sent to Whitehall in London. Excuse me. But Judge Staples started this collection of all the documents surrounding the Gaspee affair, and so we're indebted to him for that. And his conclusion is that it started these committees of correspondence that take us right to the revolution. That's Judge Staples' conclusion in this. And I challenge that in my book, and I'll get to that in just a minute. John Russell Bartlett was the Secretary of State in the 1860s, and just on the eve of the Civil War, he published an official history of the event, which was almost a verbatim of what Staples had done. Apparently, copyright law was not very strict back then, and he put his name on it and took credit for it. By the Gilded Age, we start seeing more and more juvenile fiction. This is another book I have in my office called When We Destroyed the Gaspee by James Otis. And these books were written for immigrant children to get them interested in American history. And they're patriotic stories that that downplay the use of violence to affect political change. We're trying to teach these immigrants who are coming to this country that you need to use the ballot box to bring about change. And so they don't want to play up sort of the violence of the Gaspee raid. They want to talk about the ways in which these patriots are helping to teach young people how to vote and vote for political change. So in the first half of the 20th century, now we come up to a closer time, the United Kingdom no longer looked like the mighty British Empire that it once was. You can see my map here where when Britain used to paint the globe red and the sun never set on the British Empire, 2 horrible world wars sealed our relationship with Canada and the UK as our closest allies. And the English-speaking Protestants had a common tradition of constitutional liberties, and we all look back on the Magna Carta and our constitutional liberties. And it seemed like, you know what, we have more in common than we are different. And so Britain and Canada didn't really feel like our enemies by the 20th century. And we started to look at things differently as we looked at the English-speaking people in sort of Anglo-America, North Atlantic. By the 1960s, you see a new left interpretation of history and of this event. They talked about the formation of a mob or a posse. And when the existing structure couldn't solve something, when you got a problem where things were just stuck, these groups would take extra legal action, they called it. So they look back at the Gaspee affair, and when the new left looks at this, they're like, don't think of them as a mob, think of it as a posse trying to solve a problem. Okay, so they gathered around somebody they called the sheriff. That might have been John Brown, that might have been Abraham Whipple. We're not sure who exactly was the sheriff, but they gathered around him and they said, look, this rum is stuck on the Gaspee. They won't come ashore. I can't arrest Lieutenant Dunningston, and I can't get my hands on this rum. We're kind of stuck. How do we unstick this situation? This isn't a Marxist interpretation of it, though. They're saying these were men of high station. This isn't a proletarian uprising. These are men of high station who are involved in the Gaspee raid. These are some of the elites of Rhode Island society. But this is a traditional model of English problem solving. This isn't anything that radical. The committees of correspondence were concerned about being accused of treason. So the committees of correspondence that were really important later in the 1774, 1775 period and into 1776 were not the committees of correspondence that came out of the Gaspee affair. Judge Staples was wrong about that. And so I talk about that some in my book and explain that. And so the great legacy of the Gaspee affair isn't the committees of correspondence like Judge Staples thought it was. The finding really that the new left comes up with is the Gaspee raid wasn't that radical. This is how colonials solved the problem when things were really stuck. So this is not a radical action. My research on this shows that a warrant to arrest a sea officer, that's not that unusual. When he would come ashore, they knew not to go ashore when there was a warrant for their arrest. Burning a vessel or just burning its boat, again, not that unusual. You heard Senator Whitehouse mention the Liberty earlier, and also the St. John, other vessels that had been burned. Attacking customs officials, that wasn't that unusual either. So sort of the conclusion here, my finding was the Gaspee raid was not that unusual. So if it wasn't that radical and it wasn't that unusual, why should we care, right? What's left to care about on the Gaspee affair? So that's sort of where we get it. But somehow it became very popular. So Sam Adams and John Allen, these two made the Gaspee raid into the Gaspee affair and made it extremely popular using newspapers and pamphlets. Colonials read a mix of newspapers and pamphlets, and the American Revolution was truly a pamphlet war. It was fought on pamphlets and in newspapers before anybody fired a shot. And these are your two advocates that I want to spend a few minutes with. So my research on this, what was unusual? Who made it an affair? John Allen, an oration on the beauties of liberty or the essential rights of the Americans, was a sermon that he gave, a Thanksgiving Day sermon on December 3rd, 1772 at Second Baptist Church in Boston. And it was a direct attack on the monarch years before Thomas Paine's Common Sense. So John Allen had newly arrived in the colonies, just like Thomas Paine, and his pamphlet was a radical attack that woke up patriot fervor, sorry, easy for me to say, fervor, during the lull. Okay, so what we considered the lull where nothing happens, what's waking up patriots? What's getting them concerned about their rights again? And it was the Gaspee, but it was this sermon that taught patriots that that this is where the raid gets its spin. This is what politicizes it. This is what gives it its interpretation. And you say, well, I've never heard of this sermon before, right? Convince me that this was a big deal. It went through 7 printings. John Allen added an addendum that attacked slavery at a time when mostly, pretty much, only Quakers had a problem with the way that slavery was practiced in these colonies. And the 4th printing and the 6th printing added an addendum. One was printed in Boston, the other was printed in Hartford, and they got as far south as Wilmington, Delaware with these printings. The reason it matters is before July 4th, 1776, there were about 400 some pamphlets that had been published. If you take those by popularity, John Allen's oration is number 6. It puts him in the top 1%. So it was hugely popular, like I said, going through multiple printings. We know that John Adams' clerks told him, and he wrote this in his diary, that the men in New England who couldn't read Allen's sermon had it read to them. They're reading it at pubs and taverns and saloons. They were reading this to the men who couldn't read. So this was hugely important. This Baptist minister, John Allen, made the Gaspee into an affair. He mentions the Gaspee 7 times in this one sermon, this one pamphlet. He makes the repugnance of human slavery into a Christian moral issue, and he appeals to the Christian sympathies of King George III and Lord Dartmouth, both. Since Rhode Islanders had to remain silent on this issue, remember, Rhode Islanders engaged in passive resistance. They went completely silent. Nobody knew anything. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew what had happened. Since Rhode Islanders went silent on this, it fell to Bostonians to make this into an important story for Northern patriots, which they did. So between Sam Adams and John Allen, they made this into an important story for patriots north of Maryland. So this Baptist minister, John Allen, like I said, he took it from a raid to an affair. He was a patriot and highly critical of His Majesty's rule in the colonies. He was also an abolitionist at a time where, like I said, mostly Quakers were among the few outspoken opponents to slavery. He had a way forward for independence and abolition, okay? So every colony north of Maryland gradually freed its enslaved people after statehood, okay? Massachusetts, I believe, freed their enslaved people with a court decision rather than legislative action. But every colony north of Maryland freed their slaves after independence, while none of the colonies south of Maryland did so. So why do we care? We have about 50 years worth of scholarship to show that the pulpit was extremely important in the American Revolution. I'm looking at authors like Tommy Kidd. I'm looking at authors like Mark Knoll, Harry Stout, and others to tell us that we know that the revolutionary rhetoric that came out of New England's pulpits were extremely important, and the Gaspee affair fits neatly into that scholarship. So let's fast forward to the 21st century. I wrote a little piece for the Rhode Island Historical Society's Encompass publication to give Rhode Island teachers assignments that they can give to students and to help them. And one of the assignments Rhode Island teachers like to give to their students is, I want you to interview a historian. So students call me on Zoom or they call me on Teams, and then they interview me and they ask me questions about the Gaspee affair. What do these students want to talk about? They want to talk about race and justice over and over again. They want to talk about Aaron Biggs. What was happening with that 19-year-old enslaved man who testified against powerful Rhode Island people during the Gaspee affair? Well, now that we look back on Aaron Biggs, it looks like he was using the chaos of the situation to escape from slavery. He joined the British Navy and disappeared. And so that was his way to run to freedom, was through the British Navy. And so that's what students want to talk to me about when they call. It's interesting that Brown University now has a Center for Slavery and Justice that it started in 2003 to go back and look at the legacy of slavery and the Brown family and the money that was used to start Brown University in Providence. They published 2 different reports, one in 2006 and another one just last year, about the Brown family's involvement in the slave trade and how they got rich through the slave trade. So the question is the Gaspee facing the same fate as the Alamo in Texas? For those of you who haven't been following the Alamo, you may know that this book came out recently, and it's no accident that the font there is supposed to look like blood, called Forget the Alamo. So instead of Remember the Alamo, it's Forget the Alamo. And why are we forgetting the Alamo? It's because as we look at it, we realized that they were fighting for their independence to protect slavery, and Mexico was threatening their slavery, and abolitionists was for, and many people moved enslaved people to Texas so they could keep their slaves. Texas declared its independence to protect slavery in Texas, in the Republic. And so the Alamo is being looked at through a different lens. And I'm asking, is the Gaspee in danger of the same thing? When we look at this, was the Brown family attacking Dunningston and the Beaver and the British Empire to protect slavery? And so let's look at that for a minute. In the Providence Journal, in the summer of 2020, a series of editorials went back and forth, and you can read these at gaspee.org, where Dr. Kincannon has put them online, and he's called it, "Was the Gaspee Burned to Protect Slavery?" And so when we look at this, was this an attack on government property? Well, yes, it was. They were shooting law enforcement officers. Young people come in, they're like, why would we defend that? Even if Duddingston was a bad cop, you don't just shoot a cop. Everybody has a right to a trial. And so they're like, why would you defend this action, even if he's a bad cop? Was Duddingston the great liberator? Was he stopping human trafficking? Was he going after the Hannah? If he was going after the Hannah, was the Hannah a slaver? That's a question for future historians to dig deeper into. We know the Brown family was neck deep in slave trading. Was the Hannah one of their slavers? That's a good question. So new scholarship is showing that the British Navy could be a tool for self-liberation for American colonial Black men. Does this change the way we view the Gaspee? So times they are changing, right? This is what young people are asking me. So we look at some recent scholarship on the Brown family and slavery in Rhode Island, grappling with their legacy, dark work, the notorious triangle. Now there's quite a bit of scholarship showing how deep the Brown family was in Rhode Island in the slave trade. But not all form of scholarship comes in the form of long form monographs. Not everything is a book. Here's a database that was made by a scholar at East Illinois University called Uncovering Hidden Lives, Developing a Database of Mariners in the Black Atlantic. And he goes through and it looks at the lives of thousands of African-American men who used the British Navy and use waterways as a way to escape slavery, like what Aaron Biggs did, and that this was actually an avenue of escape for Black men. So we ask ourselves, okay, so George III was no abolitionist, right? He was disgusted by slavery, but he wasn't really doing anything to end it. So we don't want to oversimplify that, right? We don't want to make that. But also the Somerset decision did come out in June of 1772, 9 days after the Gaspee affair. Lord Mansfield basically outlawed slavery in the United Kingdom with the Somerset decision. I shouldn't say he outlawed slavery. People thought he outlawed slavery with the Somerset decision in Lincoln's Inn at the King's Bench in London in June of 1772. So we see a drastic increase on taxation was on the sale of enslaved persons. So with this tax increase, what are the taxes that they're complaining about? When they say no taxation without representation, it's like, well, we already repealed all the taxes that you protested about. Is this a protest about taxation on enslaved persons? 4/5 of Black men remain loyal to the crown. So this is another question students ask me. They call me and they say, well, let's look at Aaron Biggs again. Why did so many Black men remain loyal to the crown and fewer of them served the patriot cause? At the end of the war, Sir Guy Carleton would not give General Washington the 3,000 escaped slaves he had in New York City. And some of them went to Nova Scotia, some of them went to New Brunswick, some went to Jamaica and the Caribbean, and some went to Africa and to Liberia. So if Aaron Biggs was actually running away from his master on June 9, 1772, the British Navy was his vehicle, and that was how he did it. So this complicates the story a little bit. The principal characters in the Gaspee raid were slave traders. And the assumption now is maybe the Gaspee raid was defending that trade. So how do we look at this affair differently? And does this change our view of it? The raid was about rum, and it was about jurisdiction, and it was about control. There's no question about that. We've been saying that for 250 years. But the principal characters of the Gaspee affair didn't get to define the affair. They remained silent, right? They remained silent for decades. We didn't hear from them. It was really John Allen, the Baptist minister, that little-known Baptist minister with his pamphlets, and Sam Adams, who defined the Gaspee affair and claimed it was about the rights of colonists of all colors. Well, in 2 out of his 7 printings, not in all of them, but in 2 of them. So the raid itself was not political, and nor was it unusual or even that radical, but Allen politicized it and made it about the rights of all people. So I think that's the positive, upbeat story you have to tell about the Gaspee affair, is what came out of this. When I talked to people in Rhode Island about this, I said, how do you feel about this? The hero of your story didn't turn out to be John Brown. Unfortunately, his stock has done nothing but go down in my lifetime. The hero of your story is a somewhat eccentric Baptist minister that people don't know much about. And my Rhode Island colleagues are like, oh yeah, we're fine with that. And I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah, we're cool. I'm like, why are you guys okay with that? And they're like, our state hero is a somewhat eccentric Baptist minister. And I'm like, of course, Roger Williams. They're used to eccentric Baptist ministers. They have the first Baptist church in America right there in Rhode Island. So this actually went over pretty well with them. In any case, what I've done is to help you take a deeper dive into this. I put a free course online at wheatonx.wheaton.edu. You can go there, and I have about a half a dozen videos to take students and teachers in greater depth through the themes that you saw in these slides tonight to talk about this in greater depth. It's a free course you can just sign up for online, or you can find it through my website at stephenpark.org. So I'd be happy to take some questions, and Andrew's taking some questions from the folks online, but I'd be happy to take questions from people in-house as well. How are we doing on time? It's 7:20. Yeah, so we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, Mitch.
That the event was not that unusual, but given the lore that came through the pamphlets and in the years since then, why hasn't this event risen to the level that the Boston Massacre has, or the Boston Tea Party?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, folks in Rhode Island know this event well. Obviously, George Washington recognized it at the time. Only 2 years later, he was celebrating June 9th and setting off fireworks. But then it didn't get into the history books later. So much of what got into the history books was a war between intellectuals in Boston, in Massachusetts, and Southern intellectuals in Virginia. Why were they fighting about America's origins? They were fighting the Civil War on paper. Okay, so from let's say the 1790s until 1861, we basically fought America's Civil War on paper. And it was fought between really Harvard scholars, people like Jared Sparks, George Bancroft, and Southern intellectuals, mostly Virginians, battling who's the rightful heirs of Americans' history. And so they played up the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, Somerville, Bunkers Hill. These are the things we've heard about. Virginians played up Jamestown in 1607 and the Jamestown colony and Bacon's Rebellion. And right, so they're fighting a war between these two powerful states, these well-populated states. And that's so much of America's history comes out of that battle. And so you see how much Connecticut and Rhode Island gets left out of that, right? So we know very little of what's happening in these other colonies at that time, because so much of America's history was written with that in mind. Yeah. Does that help? Does that make sense? Yeah, that's where the two big centers of intellectual power of the antebellum period were coming from. Yeah, Samantha.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So I actually have a follow-up question on that. So Pennsylvania was also a pretty radical colony, and I noticed that one of the prints was not done in Philadelphia, but Wilmington. Can you speak to that a little bit? How did this story kind of play out for Pennsylvanians?
Yeah, Allen you're right. So the two centers of patriot activity were Boston and Philadelphia. Nobody's questioning that. He had trouble finding a publisher when he put the abolitionist addendum on there. That was certainly a fringe view. It was a minority view, and he had trouble finding publishers who would pick it up. So he had to leave Boston. He went to New London, Connecticut, and then ultimately Hartford, Connecticut, and then, as he said, Wilmington, Delaware. He couldn't find a publisher in Philadelphia to pick it up, which is a shame. But yeah, so you can read it online. It's easy to find. John Concannon put it at gaspee.org if you want to read Allen's sermon, and he's got the addendum there as well. So it's easy enough to find. Does that help? Yes.
Hey, thanks so much for your talk. It was really fascinating. I think you mentioned a man named Abraham Whipple that might
Yes.
have been the man with his finger on the trigger.
Yes.
Do you know if he has any relationship with the Rhode Island judge, William Whipple, that later signed the Declaration? It's not a gotcha. I just happen to be from a line of Whipples, and it's a historical curiosity.
Yes, probably. It's a small colony, right? But yeah, so Abraham Whipple ended up in Ohio, I believe. So I believe he got one of the land grants. So he did not stay in Rhode Island, but yeah, I believe so.
Great, thank you. Senator Whitehouse mentioned that you're looking for pieces of the Gaspee, what's left. I do underwater archaeology locally here, and I'm just curious if you're finding anything.
Yeah, so Kathy Abbas got a grant from the state. It's a modest amount of money, but it's a start. I think you'd have a much better chance of finding things before 1938. I think the Great Hurricane probably made it very difficult to find anything now. It would be interesting. And then also to know that that's what it really is. I mean, there's so many wrecks in Narragansett Bay. And then it was, of course, it was a wooden ship. So you look at something like the Endurance that's so incredibly well preserved. Well, that's because it's frightfully cold water. And so that certainly helped its preservation. A man named Daniel Vaughan was paid to go out and salvage the Gaspee at the time and get all the iron fittings that would have survived. And he put them in a warehouse. And so where those went, we don't know. So some of the things that might have stayed behind or would have rusted away, most likely. The water's just too warm and there's too much oxygen in the water for it to last. But that would be great. We'll see what Kathy finds. So I know there's a renewed interest in trying to find something there. It's very rare that you have a Barry Clifford type moment like you did with the Witta Galley in 1984 in Wellfleet on Cape Cod, where he comes up holding the bell with the name printed on it. That's very rare that you get that kind of a finding. But he did find the Witta Galley, which is amazing. So I think, Andrew, you have a question from online?
Yes, we do have a few questions from Zoom. The first one is, can you provide a description of the Gaspee in terms of size, number of sails, number of guns,
Oh,
et cetera?
sure. Sure. So the Gaspee started as a sloop, and in 1768, she was taken to a careening yard in Canada where she was laid over on her side and made into a schooner. So then you have two sails that you get much more power with a smaller crew to go to a schooner rig vessel. So that's two masts and two large sails. She could sail with as few as 19 men. There are 8 swivel guns, so it's just small guns. These are not big ships of the line. These aren't big cannon. They had a small arms chest that was locked during the raid, so they did not have ready access to their guns. They just looked very unprepared, which is why Dunningston had to sort of defend himself at his court martial. That they could be so easily overrun by civilians. They were just woefully unprepared, especially given all the warnings they had that they were in danger and that the beaver wasn't there to help protect them. They just seemed kind of unwise to have let their guard down so much. But she was probably about 49 feet long. The vessel you saw in the slide is the Sultana. That's probably the closest reenactment vessel we have in size and shape to the Gaspee. Like I said, we'd love to see a movie kind of like what the Amistad had in 1998. That would be the vessel we would probably try to use to make a movie about the Gaspee affair. So Ken Burns is making a multi-part series in 2026 about the American Revolution. And the scuttlebutt I'm hearing around Rhode Island right now is he's skipping right over the Gaspee affair. So I hope that's wrong. I hope that's not true. But I know they're reaching out to him to try to make sure that the Gaspee affair gets at least a mention in the events leading up to the American Revolution. Because even if we've forgotten a lot of it now, it was certainly extremely important at the time. And Allen's sermon and his pamphlet makes that very clear, that it was extremely important that he was in the top 10 of pamphlets with his Gaspee preaching. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. We had a question from our in-person audience about Abraham Whipple, and one of our Zoom attendees wants to know if you can dive in a little bit more about his role and what part he played in the whole thing.
Yeah, so Ephraim Bowen and Dr. Monty claim that he was one of the 2 ringleaders and that's who the British really wanted to arrest. They really wanted to arrest a ringleader. They don't try to arrest the whole mob or deal with large groups of people. they want to blame the leaders and kind of set an example of them. And so that's how 18th century justice worked in British America. And so one person claimed to be the sheriff and one person claimed to be the captain. Those were the two people that the British government were most interested in. And we think one of those was Brown and one of those was Whipple. And that Brown was probably the one claiming to be the sheriff and Whipple was probably the one claiming to be the captain. He worked for John Brown. He was an excellent skipper, went on in the American Revolution to command vessels in the Rhode Island Navy and then the Continental Navy. So, and then, like you said, retired comfortably to Ohio. So, and got to live the life of a farmer.
Great. One question about Jacob Green. Was Nathaniel Green a partner with him in the ownership of the Hannah?
Yes, and of the Fortune, right?
The Fortune,
Of
right.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Hannah was one of John Brown's
Sure,
vessels,
yes.
and the Green family owned the Fortune, right? And so that's certainly the initial seizure that started this off. I believe they were off of East Greenwich on the flats there, and Dunningston men stopped them there in February. So it's interesting. Winter was the smuggling season, and it was in close to shore. And so Dunningston was good at this, and that's part of what ticked them off. He was good at his job. He went out in the winter into these shallow waters and got them. And so they pushed back.
So that's a good lead into the next one. Can you give a little bit about, dive in a little bit more about Duddingston and his reputation and, you know, what he was doing, because he was almost overbearing in his seizures.
Yeah, so certainly the Patriot version of the story emphasizes that, don't they? That he was a bad cop. He was overzealous in his duties. The Royal Commission found that. Here's what the British government did wrong. At the end of the French and Indian War, normally they would have to lay off a huge number of sailors, and they would go to half-time pay. There isn't enough work for them. There isn't enough money for them. In order to keep these men employed, and so they wouldn't turn to a life of piracy or whatever they might do, to keep them employed in His Majesty's service, they merged the commission for customs and the commission in the Navy. So you would see officers who had a naval commission and customs officers who had a custom commission. They merged the two. So Dunningston's actually holding two commissions. Well, people engaged in all kinds of violence against customs officers all the time, and they'd been doing so for a century and gotten away with it. Now, when you engage in violence against a customs officer, that person is also a sea officer. That's not going to end well, is it? You know, and Whitehall can't turn a blind eye to that. They need to prosecute this. They need to follow up on this. And so that was really the mistake, is combining those two commissions in order to give work to their officers, which they did. It put them in an awkward position where now they couldn't turn a blind eye to it. Yeah.
And one question about Governor Wanton. I've read personally in some various locations that he was kind of a mediator between the merchants and the Admiralty. And can you elaborate more on his thought process when he was ordered by the Admiralty to put out that proclamation and issue that reward?
Sure. So when Judge Staples wrote his account in 1840 or 1845, he looked back on this and said, well, look, Governor Wanton, when the revolution came and when push came to shove, he sided with the crown. So he was a loyalist. So I'm sure he was zealous in carrying out his duties for the crown in 1772. That's not what my research found. I had to push back on Judge Staples on that and say, no. He was obstructing justice all along the way. And he very carefully protected his friends and protected the powerful merchants. Remember, all these Rhode Island families were intermarried. They all were related to each other and they all looked out for each other. There was no way anybody was going to get thrown under the bus here. And they knew it. And so, yeah. Yeah. And so Governor Wanton did a nice job of protecting his friends. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions from the audience?
Just two quickies. Did you bring copies of the book for sale?
The pardon?
Copies of the book for sale?
Yes, unfortunately, my publisher ran into some supply chain issues.
Oh,
And we were trying to have the book here for tonight, so I could sign copies. And unfortunately, they didn't make it.
Okay.
So
Sorry. Okay. Second question is, I like the idea of a movie considering the 250th anniversary of all. I'm having a hard time visualizing, with all of these questions, the new research, the great questions that are being asked. Has anybody given any thought to sort of the narrative, the through line? Start, middle, end. It's like a choose your own ending movie right now.
yeah, right. If I could have made a movie in 2017 before, it was nice and neat and clean. And now as we think about more and more issues with race and justice and the role of slavery in the 1770s and 1780s, and Aaron Biggs, of course, complicates the question, and John Allen complicates the question. And so it's harder to make, but that's okay if the movie raises questions and it doesn't answer them all. That's okay. That's what history's like. We're never going to have full knowledge of the past. We don't even have full knowledge of the present. Which has became abundantly clear. And so that's okay if you leave some things unclear in a movie. But yeah, you're right. American movie makers like things tied up nice and neat, and they nice clean stories. And this one is getting more complicated. Just as what happened to the Alamo got much more complicated. Yeah. So, Andrew, if you had some outgoing words for us at 7:30.
Round of applause for Dr. Park here. We do appreciate you making the trip from Illinois. So thank you for being here with us tonight for the 250th anniversary. I was very glad to lock you in on the actual date of the end of the incident. So thank you. And to you in the back, University of Chicago Press and West Home Publishing. It's available on their website, or should be soon, as well as Amazon too. So I hope this entices people to go out and purchase the book. So thank you. Now, before we officially conclude tonight's program, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't plug some upcoming programs. On Monday through Wednesday, this upcoming week, we are holding here at Anderson House a very unique experience known as Art in Bloom DC. And this is an exclusive exclusive event that features 30 of DC's most creative florists who have taken the art and architecture of Anderson House, which you see around you, and have created various floral arrangements. And so they will have their displays throughout the house, and it is free to come and view it through Monday through Wednesday. More information about the hours can be found on our website. And we are holding a public reception on Tuesday night where you can meet the florists, the designers, and tour the museum. The garden will be open in the back here, which usually isn't open. So we invite you to come out. You can purchase tickets to the reception and find out more viewing hours on our website, www.americanrevolutioninstitute.org. Also, next Thursday, we have our next historical program, which is a lecture featuring Dr. Ronald Gibbs of Stanford University. And he will be discussing medicine in the American Revolution. And that will be right here at Anderson House, June 16th at 6:30 p.m. And that accompanies our current exhibition, Saving Soldiers Medical Practice in the Revolutionary War, which is right behind me. And we have our curator in the back here, Ellen Clark, our library director. So Ellen worked very hard on that. So make sure you stop and talk to her later. So got your plug in, Ellen. There you go. Without further ado, I'd like to thank Dr. Park for being here. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, all of you for joining us at home. And thank you for your continued support of our mission. So until next time, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.